On September 21st, 2023, American commentator and media personality Tucker Carlson interviewed Colonel Douglas MacGregor, a former U.S. Army officer and veteran of Operation Desert Storm, also known as the First Gulf War. This interview contained a lot of misinformation, and today I'm going to fact-check that interview and add context where I can. A couple of things to start. This video is probably going to get shared a lot, so allow me to introduce myself. My name is Ryan Macbeth. I served as an anti-armor and heavy weapons infantryman, retiring after 20 years of service, and I did a couple of combat and non-combat deployments. While serving, I obtained a bachelor's degree in computer science, a master's in engineering management, and an MSc in cybersecurity. In my civilian life, I wrote C4ISR software solutions. C4ISR means command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Basically, I find the bad guys, and then I hand that information over to my clients who will either continue surveillance or use more kinetic means on the subject. Now, I currently do consulting for Velocity, a private intelligence agency used by government and private companies who want to know who is doing what and why. I also run a YouTube channel where I do investigative journalism and expose misinformation. To start, this is not a reaction video where I'll watch the interview and give you a bunch of sarcastic quips. I'm going to evaluate Colonel MacGregor's statements using ICD-203, the standard for the intelligence community. If you're watching this video on Substack and you're a free viewer, I would really appreciate it if you could toss me $5. Also note that all of my references are available on Substack as well. If you're watching this on YouTube, keep in mind that this is protected by fair use doctrine for commentary, criticism, news reports, and scholarly reports. And if you have $5, head over to Substack and toss them to me. It all helps fund this channel to help fight disinformation. The link to the full Tucker Carlson interview is in the description below or on the Substack link page. Also note that Mr. Carlson and Colonel MacGregor have a First Amendment right to free speech. I am in no way advocating deplatforming them. I just want to fact check the interview. Also note that the truth has a ceiling, but the sky is the limit for lies. One of the disadvantages of telling the truth is that the truth has context and nuance and logic and can be grounded in science. Lies are easier because they're simpler to tell and rely less on critical thinking skills. Also note that I don't care about politics. I'm not a Republican, I am not a Democrat, I don't care about American, Russian, or Ukrainian politics. I'll leave that political stuff to Peter Zeihan, he's great at it. I'm just concerned about the tactical and technical elements of this specific interview. So let's get started.
Pretty much everything that NBC News and the New York Times have told you about the war in Ukraine is a lie. The Russian army is incompetent, they claim. Ukraine is a democracy. Vladimir Putin is Hitler and he's trying to take over the world. Thankfully, the Ukrainians are winning.
So this runs from 0 to 17 seconds at the start of the video, and it's the first logical fallacy proposed by Tucker Carlson. This is called the straw man fallacy, which involves misrepresenting an opponent's argument in a weaker or distorted form to make it easier to attack or refute. I have yet to see anyone in the mainstream media say that Ukraine is winning. I've been following this war since the beginning, and I've often said that both Russia and Ukraine will lose this war. The only question is who loses less. Russia is a pariah among nations. Sweden and Finland have decided to join NATO. The supremacy of Western weapons has been on display for the entire world and, more importantly, for China to see. In Ukraine's case, they are going to be dealing with demining and rebuilding for years to come. Nobody wins this war. Everybody loses. It's really a contest to see who loses less. So Mr. Carlson's argument is really a brilliant piece of propaganda here because the average Tucker Carlson viewer will never check NBC or the New York Times to see if they ever said that Ukraine is winning. Also note that Mr. Carlson doesn't provide proof of any of these claims. Let's move on to 30 seconds in.
Ukraine is being destroyed. Its population is being slaughtered in lopsided battles with a technologically superior enemy.
So this is called the false assertion fallacy, where someone asserts a statement as true even though it's clearly false, lacking the evidence to support it. If the Russian army were so technologically superior, why haven't they reached their objective? Kyiv. Well, we're going to see a lot of that in this interview, and the interview really hasn't even started yet. The truth is that the Russian army and the Ukrainian army are at rough technological parity, although each side has their own technological advantages. Russia has a significant advantage in long-range cruise missiles and air-to-air missiles. They also have a slight advantage in electronic warfare. Ukraine has a significant advantage in precision-guided munitions. The Javelin anti-tank missile is a good example. This is the missile that saved Kyiv. This is a fire-and-forget missile that guides itself to the target automatically, and Russia has nothing like this and no countermeasures for it. Now, Russia has been able to use jammers to degrade the GPS capability of guided weapons like HIMARS and JDAM-ER, but those weapons also have inertial guidance. Think of inertial guidance like the accelerometer on your phone. So in the end, jamming GPS degrades the capability, but it means instead of hitting a specific window of a building, you just hit the building. So let's skip ahead to 41 seconds.
As that happens, the question will inevitably arise, who's going to replace them? If the Ukrainians can't beat Putin, who will? The answer, of course, will be us. American troops will fight the Russian army in Eastern Europe. That's most likely.
Again, this is the false assertion fallacy. If the United States were preparing for a war with Russia, it would need to start calling up National Guard and reserve troops like right now. Specifically, you would need you need heavy armor. You need the 28th out of Pennsylvania, the 34th out of Minnesota, the 36th out of Texas. It would take about 3 to 6 months to get them trained up on their equipment and move it over to Europe. You would also need to move the 1st Armored and the 1st Cav out of CONUS, out of the continental United States, and get them over to Europe right now. Since none of this is happening, you can assume that fighting a major land war in Europe is not a concern right now. So let's skip to the interview where Colonel MacGregor comes in.
Ukrainians now, we think, have lost 400,000 men killed.
So this is kind of a weird assertion because historically the ratio of dead to wounded is 3 to 1. So if 400,000 troops are dead, that would mean we would expect to see 1.2 million wounded. For context, the generally accepted size of the Ukrainian army is about 500,000 active duty personnel. So if Colonel MacGregor were correct, then their military would be down to 100,000 troops. And if that were the case, Russia would be halfway to Kyiv by now. Colonel MacGregor doesn't provide any sources for his claim, but the British newspaper The Guardian indicates that perhaps 17,500 soldiers have been killed on the Ukrainian side. If you expand that mathematically, you get to 5,200 wounded, although that number seems a little low to me personally. It's probably more like 100,000 wounded on the Ukrainian side. And wounded is a weird thing to count, because if a soldier gets wounded and then gets treated and recovers and goes back to his unit and then gets wounded again, how many wounded do you have? So that's a tough one to get at, right? Because you could have some people who've been wounded multiple times and come back to fight. But all the same, I think there's some hyperbole here. The truth is that neither Ukraine nor Russia released casualty figures. The Guardian also claims that Russia has lost 120,000 killed with 300,000 wounded. This fits the rough 1-to-3 ratio a little more accurately. And if you wonder why Russia has lost more men, it's because Russia has been on the offensive. You typically lose more casualties in the offense than in the defense. So using ICD 203, I would say that this statement is very unlikely to be true. All right, next up.
And we know that Ukrainian units at the platoon and company level, that's with anywhere from 50 to 150 to 200 men, are in piecemeal fashion surrendering to the Russians. Not because they don't want to fight, it's because they can't fight anymore. They have so many wounded, they can't evacuate them. And commanders are saying, well, if I can't evacuate my wounded, I'm going to surrender because otherwise the wounded will die. And so they call the Russians, and they all speak Russian, and tell them on the radio, look, I've got 50, 60 wounded here. I'm going to surrender because I don't want them to be killed. And the Russians from the very beginning have always treated the Ukrainian soldiers very fairly.
So let's unpack this. Ukraine is having a hard time moving casualties out of the combat zone, but that's mainly because in a Lisco or large-scale combat operation environment, you can't use helicopters for evacuation because they'll be shot down. As for Ukrainians surrendering to receive medical attention, that may be happening on a limited basis, but I have no evidence of that. I have seen footage of how Russia treats its wounded, and it doesn't look good. I did a video, I think last week, about Russian wounded who are waiting for Casevac out in the sun with no medics present. So I don't know how well Russia takes care of its casualties, but the evidence that I have seen shows that they are not taking good care of their casualties. So this may be happening on a limited basis when there is no other choice, but I don't see it happening frequently. So I would give this a roughly even chance. Let's skip to 4 minutes and 28 seconds.
They have over 300,000 combat troops in reserve in Russia. And I think they're sitting there and not being released to fight because President Putin anticipates the possibility that we will intervene in Western Ukraine.
This is an interesting claim. Again, the colonel doesn't provide any proof, but if there were 300,000 troops waiting somewhere in Russia, we would know about it. 300,000 troops is roughly twice the number of troops the U.S. used to invade Iraq at the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom. So if there were 300,000 troops sitting around somewhere, we would see TikToks of soldiers complaining that they were just sitting around doing nothing. Also, 300,000 troops is a lot to sit and do nothing. If Russia really expected to fight NATO, then it would be wise to rotate those troops into Ukraine so that the troops that are currently there can rest and refit. So you rotate those troops in, they can see a little bit of combat, learn a little bit about how to survive, and then rotate back out again to rest. I see no proof that this is happening, and the colonel doesn't reference a source, so using ICD 203, I would call this unlikely. Let's skip to 447.
The consequences for us and for NATO will be devastating because we are not ready to fight the Russians.
I think I see where the colonel is going with this. For 20 years, the U.S. was fighting a coin or counterinsurgency battle, and this is a LSCO, or large-scale combat operations fight. For the past couple of years, the U.S. Army has concentrated on the Lisco fight, so I don't believe that this is as relevant as the colonel believes. I was just recently at Fort Campbell, where I got to watch an air assault operation, even took part in a scouting mission, and it was all Lisco. These people know what they're doing. Let's continue to minute 8.
By a Prussian army that was a modern force, highly disciplined, very competently led, trained, and equipped. So we're not there. We have equipment that is decades old. The tanks that I served on, for instance, when I went to war in 1990, were virtually brand new, state of the art. Those tanks are still out there. They've been rebuilt, but they're not new anymore. They're no longer as capable as they once were.
So I'm kind of confused as to why Colonel MacGregor brought this up. It kind of leads me to believe that he may not have an understanding of modern digital systems. Yes, the hulls of our M1 tanks are the same. When you get inside a modern M1 tank, you have sensors like the CITV, the Commander's Independent Thermal Viewer, which can find and designate targets independent of the gunner. You also have digital systems like the FPCV2, which is kind of like a video game quest map, which can also do messaging and overlay maps and show your location. So perhaps the colonel really isn't familiar with the technical upgrades in the past 30 years since the first Gulf War that he served in, but the M1 is barely the same tank. So let's move to 9 minutes and 21 seconds, where he makes a strange claim about thermal detection on the M1 tank.
So the engine is so hot that you can track the movement of U.S. Army ground forces with tanks from low Earth orbiting satellites.
I'm not aware that our adversary has this capability, but I can tell you that one of the first things that the U.S. would do in any kind of conflict is degrade the adversary satellites. The Space Force has an organization called Space Delta III, which uses the counter-communications system, which can shut down an adversary satellite without destroying the satellite and creating more space junk. Again, the colonel may not be aware of this capability of the Space Force. Let's skip to 1040.
The only limitation on your ability to target and destroy the enemy is ammunition. The Russians, of course, have no shortages whatsoever. You recall at the beginning of this, we have all these shortages, right? The Russians can't keep up with missiles. The Russians can't keep up with shells. Well, they have multiple manufacturing facilities operating 7 days a week at 24 hours a day. We have no surge capacity in the United States. It would take us many, many months to come up to that kind of standard where we could actually compete in high-end conventional warfare.
So this is probably the most accurate thing that Colonel MacGregor has claimed. Russia seems to be acquiring artillery and is still building missiles, and nobody can figure out how. The U.S. has just recently started to ramp up its artillery production. But one issue with this statement is that the colonel is forgetting about the U.S. Air Force. Remember, during the first Gulf War, of which he was a part of, the coalition bombed the living daylights out of Iraq for 6 weeks before sending in ground troops. So it is highly doubtful that in any conflict between NATO and Russia, those ammunition plants would be untouched by air power. It would probably be the fourth thing targeted after air defenses, command and control, and air bases. This doctrine was called Airland 2000. It was developed in the 1980s, and the colonel should be familiar with this since he was an officer during the 1980s. So I'm not quite sure why the colonel is ignoring it.
The world has changed. Warfare has changed. Integrated air defenses will knock virtually everything that flies out of the sky. That we will then fall back on a nuclear deterrent, a tactical nuclear weapon that says, if you keep advancing, we'll have to use a nuclear weapon.
So a couple of things. Air defense is something that Russia does well, but one thing the US does really well is SEAD, or suppression of enemy air defenses. The F-16J model is specifically designed to carry HARM anti-radiation missiles in a hunter-killer capacity, meaning the F-16 flies and tries to bait surface-to-air missile radars in illuminating it. Once the F-16 is illuminated, it fires a missile right down the path of the illuminator. And even if the adversaries turn off their radars, the HARM missile remembers the location of the radar and goes right after it. But then the colonel raises the specter of nuclear weapons. Well, if everything that flies gets shot down, then a tactical nuclear weapon carried by a fighter or a cruise missile would also logically get shot down. This is called the conflicting conditions logical fallacy. You could say that, well, cruise missiles are less likely to get hit, but then why not just use a conventional cruise missile to take out the target? We've got plenty of them. So this is kind of a weird statement. At 1323, the colonel gets into the reasons behind the war, and he brings up the specter of American nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
And of course, the next step was that we bring in our missiles and station them in eastern Ukraine, which puts them in a couple of minutes away from all of Russia's cities and all of Russia's nuclear deterrent.
So this is kind of a strange argument I've seen from people who support Russia during this war. The fact is that today, right now, we have nuclear ballistic missile submarines that can hit targets in Russia in under 15 minutes. The US does have nuclear weapons in Europe, but they're mainly free-fall, aircraft-delivered gravity bombs like the B-61. I believe the last nuclear missile the Army had in Europe was the Pershing missile, and they got rid of that in 1991. This was back during the time when the Army had to have nukes too, because the Air Force and the Navy had them. So in order for this to make logical sense, the Army would have to spend money to develop a new type of nuclear missile, or perhaps retrofit Tomahawk cruise missiles that could be fired from land with nuclear weapons. I don't really see the Army spending money developing a new series of nuclear weapons to be fired from land when we already have a 15-minute deterrent at sea right now. So it's kind of a strange argument that really doesn't take the Navy or the cost of developing new weapons and missile systems into account.
And Russia today is stronger than it has been in 30 or 40 years. You have a Russian military establishment that is now more potent and more capable than the Russian military was in the mid-1980s.
So in some ways this is true if you look at it from the standpoint of tactical and technical proficiency. Experience is a harsh teacher, and if a soldier can survive their first couple of weeks in combat, I think they have a greater chance of becoming proficient simply because they learn what not to do. Now there's always random chance. A shell doesn't care how much experience you have. When it's your day, it's your freaking day. My first sergeant had 25 years of experience, and he still hurt his back in Afghanistan getting out of a vehicle and had to get medevaced. So Russian soldiers are learning, and the Russian army is adapting. They pretty much have abandoned battalion tactical groups. They're now using drones to spot artillery at the battalion level. But you know who else is learning? The Ukrainians. So while the Russian military may be more capable tactically and technically, it's because they've been fighting. But the Ukrainians are getting the exact same experience, and they're leveling up just as fast. And you can bet that NATO is taking notes, and so is China. And those lessons will be applied to strategies for the next war. So using ICD 203, I actually think that this is likely, at least on a tactical level. Let's move to 2033, and you're going to hear something that made me so shocked I actually had to watch it 3 times to make sure that I heard it right.
You can't defeat what the Russians have built. They were the first back in the 1970s to understand the criticality of linking intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance in space, as well as on land and at sea, with strike weapons. What's a strike weapon? Rockets, missiles, guided artillery for precision.
So I used to write ISR software, and I still have a foot in that world with Velocity, and I am not aware that Russia has capabilities that exceed our own intelligence gathering capability. As for guided munitions, I'm aware of the Krasnopol, which is a laser-guided shell, but I've never actually seen one in use. Russia's just recently started developing the Fab 500 M62 with a bolt-on glide kit. So hearing this is just kind of so shocking. I was initially at a loss for words. When you look at videos of Russian artillery, they don't tend to use guided munitions. They don't even use time delay or proximity warheads. The warheads are actually hitting the ground and blowing up as opposed to blowing up in the air, which is a capability that the US has had since World War II. Also, much of Russia's artillery is Grad rocket artillery, which is unguided, and it just blankets an area with rockets or cluster submunitions. So I'm going to have to call this very unlikely. Russia isn't even close to the US in form of precision weapons. So let's skip to 3003, where we hear about equipment again.
McConnell, who says, we're so fortunate that we're doing so much damage to the Russians. This will set them back for 10 years. They've lost all this equipment. The Ukrainians have done a great job. Well, of course, all that's a lie. That's a blatant falsehood. And then he follows up by saying, and we're offloading equipment so that we can replenish with newer equipment. Well, unfortunately, the new equipment we're going to buy looks an awful lot like the old equipment. So you're not necessarily getting new top-of-the-line material. You're just getting new versions of what you've already got.
So I covered this before. Just because something looks like the old equipment doesn't mean that it's old. For example, this is the Bradley that we sent to Ukraine. It was the M2A2 ODS. Now, this is the Bradley M2A4 Bradley, which has an improved powertrain. It's all digital. It has a commander's independent thermal viewer that can scan for targets independent of the gun. This is not the same Bradley that the Colonel saw in Desert Storm. So again, the Colonel may be unfamiliar with technical advances over the past 30 years. Let's go to 3134, and we're going to talk about corruption and reselling of weapons.
Some of the equipment reaches the troops. A lot of it is sold off, ends up in arms bazaars like Kosovo, or we see it now being used by the drug cartels. We saw somebody working for one of the major cartels that is also involved in human trafficking walking around with a Javelin missile.
So this has been a thing for a while. I have no evidence that weapons are ending up in Kosovo or Mexico. The Javelin that the Colonel is referring to is actually an AT-4, which is a short-range rocket launcher. So the fact that the Colonel doesn't know the difference between a Javelin and an AT-4 is somewhat disconcerting. But like I said, he's older. He may not be familiar with some of the modern weapon systems on the battlefield. Maybe he misspoke. I've misspoken before on podcasts. It's easy to do. But I happen to know that picture of what he's talking about, and I've already proved that this was an AT-4 inert training round, and you can see that by the yellow band. I did a whole video on that. Now, a lot of newspapers may be supporting Ukraine, but a story with evidence about an arms trafficking of anti-tank weapons, that would be a Pulitzer Prize worthy story. I don't care how much your newspaper supports Ukraine, you want that Pulitzer, right? So as far as I can see, I've yet to see any news organizations actually prove that anti-tank weapons are being sold from Ukraine into Mexican cartels. And if these weapons were delivered, they would almost certainly be used, because the Mexican police and military have armored vehicles, and these would be very useful against those armored vehicles. And so far, I've seen no evidence of their use. So I would say that using ICD-203, the odds of Ukraine reselling anti-tank weapons is very unlikely. Let's skip to 3419, where the Colonel talks about submarines.
Today, if you have forces forward, they're easy to identify, easy to target, easy to destroy. So what's the point of having a lot of forces forward? Well, we can always reinforce them. No, you can't. How do you get across these vast oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, when your opponents have submarine fleets?
So this is an interesting argument. I mean, there were submarines in World War II. We managed to get convoys across the Atlantic and the Pacific. Right now, Russia has, I believe, 30 attack submarines, some diesel-electric, some nuclear. Most of them are actually used to defend bastions. When Russia sends its own nuclear missile submarines out to sea, they tend to keep them in the Kara Sea, and Russian attack submarines protect them inside of these bastions. So, I mean, it's a unique argument, but I'm not sure of its validity. Then at 3511, we see another weird question.
How many Americans do you think are assisting or fighting on the side of Ukraine right now?
Well, I don't know, but I imagine it must be hundreds, because the President of the United States, as you know, has authorized combat pay for Americans in uniform in Ukraine. Now, didn't specifically say uniform, just said Americans serving in Ukraine. So I imagine large numbers are in other uniforms, not necessarily American.
So Americans serving in Ukraine, which would mainly be Marines at the embassy or some special forces who are tracking shipments of weapons, are basically getting paid an extra $7.50 per day in what's called imminent danger pay. Then you get this other weird statement about other uniforms. And the actual notice doesn't say that at all. It says U.S. troops. And I think maybe the colonel is implying that U.S. volunteers or the International Legion are getting combat pay from the U.S., and that just isn't true, because I know members of the International Legion and they have never once mentioned that to me. So using ICD 203, I'm going to call this almost no chance. And I'm not entirely sure why the colonel said that. I want to skip to an interesting quote at 4453.
High-tech startups? What the hell are they? What are they doing for us? A new app on your phone? We've got to wake up and say, oh, well, AI is better algorithms.
I think a little piece of the Col MacGregor puzzle just popped into place. The man's 76, and he may be mistrustful of technology. AI isn't better algorithms. It's an entirely new way of gathering data to enable faster decision making. And some of the efforts I've been involved in were pretty eye-opening, because I knew what the adversary was doing before they did. So again, I think the colonel may be unaware of the advances in technology that have come along in the past 30 years. Everybody is talking about AI, because AI is really going to assist us with targeting. I strongly suggest you watch the Palantir AIP video, which will be available in the description below or on my Substack, because that is where the future is headed. Finally, let's skip to 4915.
And that's been Putin's effort from day one. He's been interested in restoring Russia as an Orthodox Christian state with a true national identity and a strong national culture. That's probably another reason why so many people want to destroy Russia, because it's the last European state that has not been flooded with foreigners and turned into some sort of polyglot experiment.
So that's a perspective, but this line is just not factually correct. Russia's population is about 10% Muslim, mainly Chechens, but also in Dagestan, they have a majority Muslim Russian republic. If you look at the Yakut people, these are Russians. So this just isn't factual. Now let's skip to 5102, where the colonel talks about the Hawaiian wildfires.
The president announced yesterday on one of these tweets, somebody tweets for him, obviously, that the people that have lost everything in Hawaii, thousands of them lost everything, are going to receive a one-time payment of $700. Now, I haven't been to Hawaii in a long time. I'm not even sure I've ever been there, but I know that $700 isn't going to take care of a family for very long.
No.
But in the meantime, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars continue to flow into this black hole called Ukraine.
So that talking point of Hawaii, not Ukraine, is a Russian-generated misinformation line. I invite you to read Kellen Orbueno's article on this below. You can find it on my Substack or in the pinned comments, where she tracked how it started and how it spread. That $700 payment thing is also a misrepresentation. Yes, the government gave $700 one-time payments to people affected by the disaster, but that was to make sure they had clothes and sundry items to last until it could be determined what kind of relief status they were entitled to. So again, I'm not sure why the colonel said this when it can be so easily verified what those payments were for, but this is untrue and it's misleading. So to wrap things up, there were numerous misleading statements in this interview. This is a very challenging subject because the truth has a ceiling, and it has a structure, and it has walls, and you have to support the framework with facts. But when it comes to lies, the sky's the limit. Thank you for watching.
Oh, hi, America. It's me, Elon. If you want to be cool like me, go and get a Ryan Macbeth t-shirt or hoodie from Bunker Branding. I'm going to get a HIMARS shirt because it fires rockets, and rockets are pretty cool, just like me. Ha ha, you fool. It is me, Mark Zuckerberg, from Facebook, and I will be the coolest once I get a Patriot shirt because the system is fully automated, just like me. I'm going to get a U.S. Navy Department of the Boat People hoodie because I love their management style. Now, I will be cooler than any of you lads once I get my drone sweet drone shot. Yeah, I'm going to get a landmine marker shirt because they blow up just like Windows. Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to get. Oh, no, it is Steve Wozniak from Apple. That's right, you nerds. You think you're the coolest for wearing a shirt? Well, Ryan Macbeth does all the work, yeah. So go buy a shirt from Bunker Branding to fund Ryan Macbeth to increase your understanding. Oh, yeah!